Meet the Tiger, by Leslie Charteris, the First Saint novel, Chapter 5. Aunt Agatha is upset. Patricia Holm landed safely on her feet in the road outside the wall and set off steadily for home. She ran easily and smoothly, as a healthy girl can who has spent most of her life away from tubes and buses and taxis, although she was somewhat out of breath from keeping up with the Saint's deadly speed. She had heard the Saint's cheery "Tally-ho!" and felt that there was a message for her in it. Besides the surface bravado which was meant for the men in the garden, it was at the same time a spur to her pace, to remind her that it was up to her not to waste the advantage which his own actions were winning for her, and an encouragement to tell her that he was as fit as a fiddle and ready for any amount of rough stuff, and that there was no need for anyone to start fretting about him. So Patricia ran obediently, and it was not until the echoes of the commotion had died away behind her and lost themselves in the other indistinguishable noises of the night, and she had slackened off into a brisk walk, that she grasped the full significance of the situation. Up to that point the whole proceeding had been so fantastical and nightmarish, and the rush of astonishing events had come with such a staggering velocity that she had been temporarily bereft of the power of coherent thought. Now, in the anticlimax of easing up her headlong flight, she was able for the first time to see the general outline of the mystery and the danger. She looked at her wristwatch, and saw from the luminous dial that it was 5 minutes to 11. Say the Saint had given his orders 5 minutes ago. That meant that if anything went wrong she was still forbidden to summon the help of Khan until 10 to 12. And by that time... She shuddered, remembering the dogs. There was something sinister about Bittle and the big house behind that ominous wall. Of that she could be certain, for the mere intrusion of the Saint upon a private conversation, however compromising, could hardly have led even that impetuous young man to go to such lengths, any more than it could have made Bittle resort to such violent means to prevent their departure. She recalled the rumours which the Saint's eccentric habits had given rise to in the village, but her recollection of her brief association with him took away all the plausibility of current gossip, even while it increased his mysteriousness. Patricia racked her brain for a theory that would hold water, and found none. She assembled the outstanding facts. Templar had some reason for being in the garden that night, and some reason for butting in on the millionaire, and she could not believe that the millionaire's proposal of marriage would have given the Saint sufficient provocation for what he had done, considering the casualness of their acquaintance. Bittle, for his part, seemed to fear and hate the Saint. Templar disliked Bittle enough to seize a convenient opportunity of dotting the millionaire one with a hefty bit of bronze. That was after Bittle had produced an automatic, and the general trend of things suggested that Bittle's house was staffed with a tough bunch of bad hats, who were quite ready to deal with unwelcome visitors in a most unusual fashion, almost as though they expected unwanted interference. And normal houses and normal millionaires did not have secret bell-pushes in cigar boxes and peepholes from which their libraries could be watched. The girl had to give it up. At least, her faith in the Saint remained unshaken. It was impossible to believe that there was anything evil about the man. At that rate, Bittle was equally above suspicion, but Bittle's apparent harmlessness was of the bluff kind that might cover a multitude of sins, whereas the Saint's chief charm was his unreserved boyishness and his air of exaggerated masquerading. She felt that no sane wolf in sheep's clothing would have taken such elaborate pains to look like a pantomime wolf. Whoever and whatever the Saint was, he had done her no injury. He had been her friend, and she had left him behind to face whatever music Bittle's myrmidons had the desire and brains to provide. And the tuning up of the orchestra which she had heard gave her a vivid impression that it was no amateur affair. It was some consolation to reflect that the Saint's little solo which had opened the concert itself showed a truly professional touch. Nevertheless, she was cursing herself right back to the manor for deserting him, although she knew that if she had stayed she would only have hampered him. She had hoped to be able to steal into the house unnoticed, but as she approached she saw a dark figure leaning on the front gate, and in a moment the figure hailed her with the voice of Miss Girton. "Yes, it's me," said Patricia, and followed the woman to the door. "I heard a lot of noise and wondered what it was all about," Miss Girton explained. "Do you know? There's been some excitement." It was all Patricia could think of on the spur of the moment. She had forgotten the damage inflicted on her clothes and her person by the game of hide-and-seek in the shrubbery, and was at first surprised at the way Miss Girton stared at her in the light of the hall. Then she looked down at her torn skirt and the scratches on her arms. "You don't seem to have missed much," remarked the older woman grimly. "I can't explain just now," said a weary Patricia. "I've got to think." She went into the drawing-room and sank into a chair. Her guardian took up a position before her, legs astraddle man-like, hands deep in the pockets of her coat, waiting for the account that she was determined to have. "If Bittle's been getting fresh, it wasn't exactly that," said the girl. "I'm quite all right. Please leave me alone for a minute." The darkening alarm which had showed on Miss Girton's face gave way to a look of perplexity when she heard that her instinctive suspicion was ungrounded. She could be reasonably patient, it was one of her unfeminine characteristics. With a shrug of her heavy shoulders she took a gasper from a glaring yellow packet and lighted it. She smoked like a man, inhaling deeply, and her fingers were stained orange with nicotine. Patricia puzzled over what excuse she was going to invent. She knew that Miss Girton could be as acute and ruthless in cross-examination as a lawyer, but the saint's orders had been to say nothing before the hour had expired, and Patricia thought only of carrying out his orders. Doubtless the reason for them would be given later, together with some sort of elucidation of the mystery, but at present the sole considerations that weighed with her were those of keeping faith with the man whom she had left in such a tight corner, and of finding some way to help him out of it if necessary. "It was like this," Patricia began at last. "This afternoon I had a note from Bittle asking me to call after dinner without saying anything to anybody. It was most important. I went. After a lot of beating about the bush, he told me that he'd had a mortgage on the manor for years, and that you owed him a lot of money and were asking for more, and that he'd have to foreclose and demand payment of your debts. Was that true?" "It was," replied Agatha Girton stonily. "But why did you have to—" "Oh, surely there can't have been any need to borrow money. I always understood that Dad left a small fortune." Miss Girton shrugged. "My dear child, I had to draw on that." Patricia stared incredulously. Miss Girton, with a face of wood and in a coldly dispassionate voice, added like an afterthought, "I've been blackmailed for 6 years. Who by? Does that matter to you? Go on with your story." Patricia jumped up. "I think, in the circumstances, I'll please myself what I tell you," she said with a dangerous quietness. "It might be more to the point if you told me what you've done with the money entrusted to you." 6 years, Aunt Agatha? That was 3 years after I came here. You were always making trips abroad, and kept me on at school as long as you could. Weren't you in Africa 6 years ago? You were away a long time, I remember." "That will do," said Miss Girton harshly. "Will it?" asked the girl. If her aunt had been tearful and frightened, Patricia would have been ready to comfort her. But weakness was not one of Miss Girton's failings, and her aggressively impenitent manner could provoke nothing but resentment. A storm was perilously near when an interruption came in the shape of a ring at the front door. Miss Girton went to answer it, and Patricia heard in the hall the spluttering of an agitated Algy. In a moment the immaculate Mr. Lomas Coper himself came into the drawing-room. "Why, there you are," he gasped fatuously, as if he could scarcely believe his eyes. "And, I say, what? Been bird's nesting in your party frock?" And Algy stood goggling through his monocle at the girl's disarray. "Looks like it, doesn't it?" she smiled, though inwardly she was cursing the arrival of another person to whom explanations would have to be made. Aunt Agatha simply sagged when she saw me. "I should think so," said Algy. "What happened to the eggs? Tell me all about it." "But what have you come here in such a flurry for?" she countered. Mr. Lomas Coper gaped, groping feebly in the air. "But haven't you heard?" "Of course not, I forgot to tell you. You know we're next door to old Bittle? Well, there's been no end of a shindy. Lots of energetic souls woofling round the garden, yelling blue murder, and all Bittle's pack of Nuneaton hounds howling their heads off. So old Algy goes cantering round for news, thinks of you, and comes ramping along to see if you've heard anything about it and find out if you'd like to totter along to the Chateau Bittle and join the game. And here you are, looking as if you'd been in the thick of it yourself." Dosed priceless. Eh? What? What? He beamed, full of an impartial good humour, and not at all abashed by the unenthusiastic reception of his brilliance. Miss Girton stood over by the settee, lighting a fresh gasper from the wilting stump of the last, a rugged and gaunt and inscrutable woman. Patricia was suddenly glad of the arrival of Algy. Although a fool, he was a friend. As a fool, he would be easily put off with any facile explanation of her dishevelment, and as a friend he was an unlooked-for straw to be caught at in the turmoil that had flooded the girl's life that night. "Sit down, Algy," she pleaded tolerantly. "And for heaven's sake, don't stare at me like that. There's nothing wrong." Algernon sat down and stopped staring, as commanded, but it was more difficult to control his excited loquacity. "I'm all of a dither," he confessed superfluously. "I don't know whether I'm hoofing it on the old gibbous or the old drippids sort of style, you know." Patricia looked at her watch. It was 11:20. That meant half an hour to go before she could appeal to Khan. Why Khan? She wondered. But Algy was still babbling on. "Abso jolly old Lutley, all of a doodah. It's shocking. I always thought the merchant prince was too good to be true, and here he is coming out into the comic limelight as a sort of whatnot. I could have told you so." "Aren't you rather jumping to conclusions?" asked Patricia gently, and Algy's mouth dropped open. "But haven't you been looking up the grocery trade?" She shook her head. "I haven't been near the place. I went out for a walk and missed the edge of the cliff in the dark. Luckily I didn't fall far. There was a ledge, but I had a stiff climb getting back." He collapsed like a marionette with the strings cut. "And you haven't been fighting off the advances of a madman? No leering lunatic trying to rob you of life and or honor?" "Of course not." "Ooh." The revelation was too much for Mr. Lomas Coper. One might almost have thought that he was disappointed at the swift shattering of his lurid hypothesis. "Put the old Tootsie into it, haven't I? What? I'd better be wobbling home." Stammering out his apologies, the wretched young man took his hat, his leave, and his life. She caught his sleeve and pulled him back. "Do be sensible," she begged. "Was your uncle worried?" "Nothing ever moves the old boy," said Algy. "He just takes a swig at the barley water and says it reminds him of Blitzen's Fontaine or something. Unsympathetic, I call it." The girl's mind could give only a superficial attention to Algy's prattle. She had not known that the noise had been great enough to rouse the neighborhood, and she wondered how that would affect the saint's obscure plans. On the other hand, Bittle would hardly dare go to extremes while she was at large and could testify to some of the events of the evening, and while other people's curiosity had been aroused by the resultant hullabaloo. Then she remembered that Bittle's house and Bloom's stood some distance apart from the others, and it was doubtful whether enough of the din could have been heard outside to attract the notice of Sir Michael Lapping, or the two retired civil servants whose bungalows were the next nearest. But Bloom and Algy knew, and their knowledge might save the saint. Miss Girton, who had been holding aloof for some time, suddenly said, "What's the fuss about, anyhow?" "Oh, a noise." Algy, abashed, was unwontedly reticent, and seemed to want nothing more than the early termination of the discussion. He fidgeted, polishing his monocle industriously. "Sir John Bittle kind of giving a rough party, don't you know?" "I think we've had quite enough nonsense for one evening," remarked Agatha Girton. "Everyone's a bundle of nerves. Is there any need for all this excitement?" She herself had lost her usual sang-froid. Under the mask of grim disapproval she was badly shaken. Patricia saw the slight trembling of the big rough hand that held the limp cigarette. "Right as per," agreed Algy weakly. "Sorry, Aunt Agatha." Miss Girton was absurdly pettish. "I decline to adopt you as a nephew, Mr. Lomas Coper." "Sorry, Aunt Miss Girton. I'll tool along." Patricia smiled and patted his hand as she said goodbye, but the ordinarily super-effervescent Algy had gone off the boil. He contrived a sickly smile, but he was clearly glad of an excuse to leave the scene of his faux pas. "Come and see us tomorrow," invited Patricia, and he nodded. "Most frightfully sorry and all that rot," he said. "I never did have much of a brain anyway. Let me know if there's anything I can do, or anything, you know." "What?" "Sheer tiddly-ho." He offered a hand to Miss Girton, but she looked down her nose at it and turned away. "Honk, honk," said Algy feebly, and departed. They heard the front door close with a click, and were impressed with Mr. Lomas Coper's humility. Among his more normal habits was that of slamming doors with a mighty bang. "You were very hard on Algy," said Patricia resentfully. "I can't be bothered with the fool," responded Miss Girton brusquely. "Thank heavens he swallowed that wild yarn of yours about falling off a cliff. If he'd had any brains, the whole village would have been talking about you tomorrow. Now, what's the truth?" Patricia looked at her watch again. The time was crawling. 11:30. She looked up and responded, "That yarn's as good as another. Not for me." Agatha Girton came and stood over the girl. She looked very forbidding and masculine at that moment, and Patricia had a fleeting qualm of fear. "What happened at Bittles?" "Oh, nothing. He told me that the only way to save you was for me to marry him." "Did he?" said Miss Girton harshly. "The swine!" "Aunt Agatha, you make me sick! He is a swine! Why shouldn't I say so? And with an adjective, if I choose. Why didn't you tell him so yourself? What did you say?" Patricia pulled herself up. The saint's volcanic arrival had ended the discussion somewhat abruptly. "I didn't know what to say," answered Patricia truthfully. Miss Girton glowered down at the girl. "And then he got fresh?" Not exactly. You see, then who did?" Patricia covered her eyes. "Oh, leave me alone. Tell me how you got into his debt." "There's nothing much to tell," replied Agatha Girton coldly. "When Bittle first came and was trying to get into Bacon's society, nobody returned his calls. Then he called on me and insisted on seeing me, I suppose, because he thought the manor had the most influence. He knew I was hard up, I don't know how, and if I helped him, he'd help me. It was my only way out. I agreed. You know he's been here several times, but even then I couldn't make anyone else take him up, although he didn't seem at all uneducated and behaved perfectly. They're all snobs here. I had to go on borrowing from him, and he didn't seem to mind, though he wasn't getting much return for it. That's all there is to it." Patricia bit her lip. "I see. And even though you were using my money, you didn't condescend to tell me anything about it. What good would that have done?" "Wasn't there anything—" "Nothing whatever," said Miss Girton flatly. Patricia looked at her. "Then might I ask what you propose to do now you've come to the end of your resources?" Agatha Girton started another cigarette, and her hands were a little more unsteady. For a moment she failed to meet the girl's eye, and stared fixedly out of the window. Then she looked at Patricia again. "You must leave that to me," said Miss Girton, in a low, inhuman voice that sent an involuntary tingle of dread crawling up Patricia's spine. The girl rose and walked to another part of the room, to get away from the dull, frightening eyes of Agatha Girton. At any other time she would have known better how to deal with the revelation that had been made to her, but now all her thoughts were with the saint, and she could not concentrate on this new problem, and, if she had been able to, she would not have dared to tackle it, for fear of creating a situation which might prevent her carrying out his instructions if he failed to put in an appearance at the appointed time. Miss Girton was as strong as an ordinary man, and her temper that night was not to be trusted. 15 minutes still to go, 3/4 of an hour since she left the saint in the garden. "What's the matter with you, child?" Agatha Girton's rasping voice demanded sharply. "Why do you keep looking at your watch?" "To see the time." She felt an absurd desire to smile. The retort would have tickled the saint to death. She could visualize his impish delight, but Agatha Girton was less easily satisfied. "Why should you bother about the time? I'm not going to be badgered like this," flamed Patricia unexpectedly. Her patience had worn very thin during the last 1/4 of an hour, and she knew that her anxiety was desperately near to driving her into indiscreet anger or a flood of tears for relief. She faced Miss Girton mutinously. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, and left the room without another word. She went up to her bedroom and paced up and down restlessly. Leaning out of the wide-open window, she could hear nothing from the direction of Bittle's house. Looking the other way, she could see the black shape of Khan's cottage. There was a light in one downstairs window, Apparently the doctor had not yet retired. She thought of going round and chatting to him until the time had run out, for if all was well and the saint arrived and found her out, he would be sure to try Khan first for news of her. For a little while she hesitated. Her acquaintance with Khan was very slight. But in a moment the sound of the windows downstairs being closed and secured filled her with an unreasoning panic. She opened her door and flew down the stairs. She could hear Miss Girton pacing heavily across the lounge, but she sped past the door as silently as she could, crossed the hall and let herself out. The cool breath of the night air restored her to reason, but she did not turn back. She closed the door without a sound and walked resolutely round to Khan's house. Her ring was answered at once by the man himself, and she remembered that he kept no servant on the premises. The doctor's genial red face was one florid expression of surprise. "My dear Miss Holm, am I disturbing you?" She smiled. "I began to feel terribly dull and depressed, and I thought a little course of you would be a tonic. That is, if you can bear it." He became aware of the fact that he was preventing her from entering and stood aside. "You honor me," he said, "but I'm quite alone." "Doctors are above suspicion, aren't they?" She laughed. "And I promised to behave." He still seemed a little self-conscious, but led the way into his study. She was a little puzzled at his awkwardness, and wondered why even such an uncouth man as he had not been smoothed down by his professional training. Nevertheless, his manner, if ungraceful, was plainly irreproachable. He brought up an armchair for her and swept a mass of papers off the table into a drawer. She noticed that there were some sections of large-scale surveys among them, and he explained, "I'm interested in geology as well as bugs, you know. I'm afraid you'd find it rather a dull subject, but it amuses me, and I'm very interested in my fellow men." Before she realized what she was doing, she had asked his opinion of Simon Templar. "Templar? A very interesting specimen. I don't think I can make a pronouncement yet. I met him for the first time today. A very, unusual young man, but quite charming to talk to." Khan did not seem to wish to continue the analysis, and she was left with the idea that he would prefer to be sure of her estimate of the saint before committing himself. "Would you like some tea or some ginger beer? It's all I've got in the house." "No thanks, if you don't mind," she thought. "It's rather difficult. You see, is Mr. Templar in any danger?" Khan looked at her with a keenness that was unforeseen in a man of his type. "What makes you ask that, Miss Holm?" "Well, he talks a lot about it, doesn't he?" Khan pursed his lips. "Yes, he does," he admitted guardedly. "I shouldn't venture to give a definite opinion at this stage. Might one inquire first what Mr. Templar is to you? Is he a particular friend of yours, for instance?" "I've known him such a short time," she replied, as cautiously, "but I must say I like him very much." "Would it be impertinent to ask if you were in love with him?" pursued Khan, and seeing her blush, he averted his eyes and babbled on in an embarrassed attempt at a fatherly tone. "I see that it would. But perhaps Mr. Templar is more susceptible. As a friend, you would do him a great service by using whatever influence you have to persuade him of his foolhardiness." "Then he is in danger?" Khan sighed. "Purely of his own making," he said. "Mr. Templar has elected to play a very dangerous game. I can't say any more. Perhaps he'll tell you himself." Patricia looked at her watch for the 20th time. There were still 6 minutes to pass. Chapter 6. The Kindness of the Tiger. "Here we are again," murmured the saint. "Seeing quite a lot of each other tonight, aren't we? And how's the occiput? Not dented beyond repair, I hope." Bittle inclined his head. "A trifle primitive," he said urbanely, "but very effective. I have views of my own, however, on the subject of physical violence, which I shall present you with in due course." "Splendid," said Templar. He looked around for the man who had been covering him, and bowed to that gentleman with a smile. "Dear old Bloomin' Bloom, of course," remarked the saint sociably. "I knew we'd find you in the thick of the fun. Quite one of the dogs of the Dorp or village, aren't you? And, just in case of accidents, would you rather be blipped on the jaw or in the solar plexus?" A jolt in the tum-tum is more painful, but, on the other hand, the cove who stops one just where his face changes its mind is liable to carry a scar around with him for some time. Just as you like, of course, I always try to oblige my customers in these little details. That will do, Mr. Templar. Bittle's voice broke in curtly. I think you've talked quite enough for one evening. But I haven't started yet, complained the saint. I was just going to tell one of my favorite stories. Old Bloom's heard it before, but it might be a new one on you. The one about an Italian gentleman called Fernando, who double-crossed some of the bando. They got even for this with the aid of a kriss, and that was the end of Fernando. Any applause? The saint looked about him in his mild way, as though he literally expected an outburst of clapping. Nobody moved. Bloom still had his automatic accurately trained on the saint, and the boar's leathery face betrayed nothing. Bittle had gone ashy pale. The butler and a couple of other hard nuts who had followed the party into the library stood like graven images. "I told you he knows too much," said Bloom. "Better not take any chances this time." "I'm very upset about this," said Simon earnestly. "That one usually gets a rousing reception. Poor old Fernando, he used up so much energy cursing tigers and things that he didn't live quite long enough to tell me where the spondulics were." "Bakeham, in England, Devonshire," gasps Fernando, with the haft of the kriss sticking out of him and the blood choking his throat. "The old house." And then he died. Just like in a storybook and deuced awkward, with so many old and oldish houses lying about. But Fernando certainly hated tigers, and you can't blame him. Bloom raised the gun a trifle, and his knuckles whitened under the brown skin of his hand. "It is easily settled," he muttered, and the saint saw death staring him in the face. "No!" shouted Bittle. The millionaire flung himself forward, knocking up the pistol. Bittle was trembling. He mopped his brow with a large white handkerchief, breathing heavily. "You fool!" he jerked. "The girl's been here. He helped her get away. If anything happens to him, she'll talk. Do you want to put a rope round all our necks?" "You always did argue soundly, Bittle, darling," said the saint appreciatively. He seated himself on the table, swinging his legs, and the proverbial cucumber would have looked smoking hot beside him. "It must be arranged so as to look like an accident," said Bittle. "That damned girl will have the police buzzing about our ears unless the circumstances are above suspicion." Bloom shrugged. "The girl can be silenced," he stated dispassionately. "You'll leave the girl alone," snarled Bittle. "Where's the chief?" The saint saw Bloom's face convulse with a warning scowl. "He will return later." "Now that's good news," said Simon. "Am I really going to meet the celebrated tiger at last? You've no idea how much I want to see him, but he's such an elusive cove always incog." "You need have no fear, Mr. Templar," said Bittle, "that the tiger will show himself to you, unless he is quite certain that you will never be able to use your knowledge against him. I think," added the millionaire suavely, "that you may expect to meet the tiger tonight." The saint realized that Bittle's panic of a few moments past had been caused by the fear of being involved in a police inquiry rather than by the horror of witnessing a cold-blooded murder. Bittle was quite calm again, but there was no trace of human pity in his faded eyes, and the level tone in which his significant afterthought was delivered would have struck terror into the soul of most men. But the saint's nerves were like chilled steel, and his optimism was unshakable. He met Bittle's eyes steadily, and smiled. "Don't gamble on it," advised the saint. "I've lived pretty dangerously for 8 years, and nobody's ever killed me yet. Even the tiger mightn't break the record." "I hope," said Bittle, "that the tiger will prove to be as clever as you are." "Hope on, Sonnikins," said the saint cheerfully. They had searched him from crown to toe when he came in from the garden, but they had left him his cigarette case, and for this he was duly thankful. The case was a large one and carried a double bank of cigarettes. There were some peculiarities about the cigarettes on one side of the case which the saint had not felt bound to explain to Bittle when he returned it. For several of the victories which Templar had scored against apparently impossible odds in the course of his hectic career as a gentleman adventurer had been due to his habit of invariably keeping at least one card up his sleeve even when he had not got aces parked in his belt, under his hat, and in the soles of his shoes. Meanwhile, it had not yet come to the showdown, and the saint did not believe in performing his particular brand of parlor tricks simply to amuse the assembled company. He selected a cigarette from the other side of the case, which in itself was not quite an ordinary case, for one of the edges, which was guarded when the case was shut, was as sharp as a razor, and began to smoke with a sublime indifference to the awkwardness of his predicament. Bittle and Bloom were arguing in low tones at the other end of the room, and both were armed. The pugilistic butler was posted at the door, and it was unlikely that he would be caught napping a second time. The saint could probably have beaten him in a straight fight, but it would not have been an easy job, and the audience in this case would most certainly interfere. The other two men stood by the French windows, to prevent a repetition of the saint's earlier unceremonious exit. They were both hard and husky specimens, and the saint, weighing up the prospects with a fighter's eye, decided that retreat was effectually barred for the time being. There were few men that the saint in splendid training would have hesitated to tackle single-handed, and few men that he would not have backed himself to tie in knots and lay out all neat and tidy inside 5 minutes into the bargain. But he had to admit that a team of 3 heavyweights and a couple of automatics totaled up to something a bit above his form. Wherefore the saint stayed sitting on the table and placidly smoked his cigarette, for he had never believed in getting worked up before the fireworks started. He looked at his watch, and found that there was a clear half-hour to go before he could expect any help from outside. He blessed his foresight in telling Patricia to go to Khan if anything went wrong, but that was a last resource which the saint hoped he would not have to call upon. Simon wanted nothing less than to be under any sort of obligation to the detective, and he certainly did not want to give Khan a better hand than the deal had given him. Nevertheless, it was comforting to know that Khan was at hand in case of a hitch, not to mention the admirable Oris, who would shortly be getting restive, even if he had not started to move already. And it was satisfying to find that a similar reflection was cramping the style of the ungodly considerably. The saint's meditations were interrupted by the sound of a bell ringing somewhere in the depths of the house. The sound was very faint, but the saint's hearing was abnormally keen, and he caught what most other men would have missed, the eccentric rhythm of the ringing. He had noted this down and pigeonholed it in his mind when a knock came on the door and a man entered. He muttered something to Bittle, and the millionaire left the room. Bloom strolled over to the saint, who welcomed him with a smile. "Our one and only tiger at last." Bloom nodded, and looked curiously at the saint. "You have given us more trouble than you know," he said. "You have been extraordinarily lucky, but even the most astounding luck comes to an end. Just what they told me at Monte." Agreed the saint. "They say the bank always wins in the long run." Watching closely, Simon could just note the least flicker of Bloom's eyelids. "Fernando, of course," said Bloom, half to himself. "Even so," murmured the saint, "I know everything but the answer to the 2 most important questions of all. Who is the tiger, and where has he cached the loot? And I've a feeling that it won't be so long now before I get next to even those secrets." "You're very confident," said Bloom. The man's self-control was not far from perfection, but the saint also played poker, and he had summed up Bloom to the last full stop in the course of that brief conversation. Bloom's nerves were none too good. No man who was reasonably sure of himself would have been made to feel vaguely uneasy by such a slender bluff. That put the saint one up on Bloom, but the saint did not disclose his knowledge of the state of the score. His smile did not vary its quiet assurance one iota. "I'm an odds-on chance," said the saint lightly. "Which reminds me, how are T.T. Deeps?" Bloom did not answer, and the saint prattled on. "Now, I must say you had me thinking very hard over that dud gold mine. Why should any sane man you observe mine here that I credit you with being sane? Why should any sane man want to get control of a gold mine that hasn't turned up any gold for 2 years? That's what I said to my broker, and he sent a cable out to the Transvaal especially to find out." Back comes the reply, "We don't know. The mine hasn't been worked for ages, and only the greenhorn prospectors bother to look over the district. The old hands know that there isn't enough pay dirt for 100 square miles around the TT borings to stop a snail's tooth. And yet our one and only Hans is raking in all the shares he can find, reminding change of a stock they'd all forgotten existed, and every poor little rabbit of a mug investor is hunting up his scrip and wondering whether to unload while the unloading's good, or chance his arm for a fortune. All of which to a nasty, suspicious mind like mine is distinctly odd. Now, I'm glad to see that the worry hasn't prematurely aged you, Mr. Templar, said Bloom. Oh, not at all, said the saint. You see, just when I was on the point of going off my rocker with the strain, and my relatives were booking a room for me in a nice quiet asylum, along comes a flash of inspiration. Just suppose, Bloom only supposed, that a bunch of bad hats had brought off one of the biggest bank breaks in history. Suppose they'd got away with something over a cool $1 million in gold. Suppose they'd humped the stuff all the way over the Atlantic, and fetched up and settled down and stowed the body away in an English village so far off the beaten track that it'd be lost for good if it wasn't for the railway timetables. And then suppose, mind you, this is only a theory, suppose they felt quite happy that the Dicks weren't on the trail, and began to puzzle out how they were going to cash the proceeds of the dirty work. First of all, melt it down, there aren't so many warriors hawking golden American eagles around that the money changers don't look twice at you when you try to pass off a sack of him. Right. But now you aren't so much better off, because a golden million tots up to a hairy great ingot, and people would start asking where the stuff came from, whether you grow it in the kitchen garden or make it in the bathroom before breakfast. What then? What, indeed? Prompted Bloom in a tired voice. Why, exclaimed the saint delightedly, as though he had caught Bloom with a conundrum. What's wrong with getting hold of a dead-as-mutton gold mine, losing a lot of gold in it, and then finding it again? Quite, said Bloom with purely perfunctory interest. Simon shook his head. It won't wash, Angel Face, he said. It won't wash. Angel Face, he said. It won't wash. Really it won't. And you know it. They may have christened me Simon, but I've got a lot less simple since then. Bloom turned away very wearily, as if he found the saint's monologue so boring that he had great difficulty in keeping awake. But that did not stop him hearing the saint's soft chuckle of sheer merriment. Bloom was good, but he was not quite good enough. There had been few doubts in the saint's mind about the accuracy of his diagnosis, and those that had existed were now gloriously dispelled. Nearly all the threads were in his hands, and the tangle was gradually straightening out. But who was the tiger? That was the most important question of all, barring only the whereabouts of the spoil. Who in all Bakem kept under his modest hat the brain that had conceived and organized that stupendous coup? Bloom, Bittle and Kahn could be ruled out. That left the highly respected Sir Michael Lapping, the pleasant but brainless Mr. Lomas Coper, the masculine Miss Girton, and the two retired and retiring ICS men, Messrs. Shaw and Smith. 5 runners, and a darned sight too little help from the form book. The saint frowned. Tackling the problem in the light of the law of probability, every one of the possibles had to be ruled out, which was manifestly absurd. Wiring into it with any mystery story as a textbook, it at once appeared that Lapping was too far above suspicion to escape it. Algy was too frankly brainless to be anything but the possessor of the great brain. Agatha Girton was quite certain to turn out to be a man masquerading as a woman, and Shaw and Smith kept too much in the background to avoid the limelight. Which once again was manifestly absurd. And the order of seniority was of little assistance, for Bloom, Algy, Agatha Girton and Bittle had all been living in Bakem for some time before the tiger smashed the strong room of the Confederate Bank of Chicago. On a general estimate, Simon reckoned that the tiger had spent at least 5 years over that crime, and that was a deduction that confirmed the saint's respect for the tiger's brilliance, without going any distance to aid the solution of the mystery of the tiger's identity. The saint had got no further when Bittle returned and drew Bloom to one side. Simon could only hear a word here and there. He gathered that the tiger was furious with Bittle for taking so long and making so much noise over capturing the prisoner, that Bittle would have liked to see the tiger do better himself, that the tiger had an idea. There followed some mutterings that the saint did not catch, and then came one sentence quite distinctly. "The tiger says we must let him go." Bloom gave an exclamation, and Bittle talked further. The saint's brain was whirring like a buzzsaw. Let him go, with so much given away and most of the court cards in their hands. Simon wondered if he had heard aright. But in a moment, Bittle left Bloom and came over to confirm the sensitiveness of the saint's auditory nerves. "It is getting late, Mr. Templar," said the millionaire, "and we all feel that the festivities have been kept up long enough. Pray do not let us detain you any longer." "Meaning," suggested Simon with as much levelness as he could command, "meaning that you are free to go as soon as you like." Bittle looked hard at the saint as he spoke, and the malevolence that glittered in his eyes belied the geniality of his speech. Bittle was clearly upset at having to carry out such a command. He barked an order, and the escort of roughnecks sidled out of the room, closing the door behind them. Bloom was fidgeting with his tie, and he kept one hand in a pocket that bulged heavily. "That's nice of you," drawled the saint. "You won't mind if I take Anna, will you?" He strolled coolly over to the secretaire, jerked open a drawer and retrieved the knife that they had taken from him, slipping it back into the sheath under his sleeve. Then he faced the two men again. "Really," he remarked in a tone of polite inquiry, "your kindness overwhelms me, and I never put you down for a brace of birds too gravely burdened with faith, hope, and charity. Is Miss Holmes such an insuperable obstacle to supermen like yourselves?" "I think," said Bittle smoothly, "that you would be wise not to ask too many questions. It is quite enough for you to know, Mr. Templar, that your phenomenal luck has held perhaps for the last time. You had better say good night before we change our minds." The saint smiled. "You have no minds," he said. "The tiger says hop, and you blinkin' well hop. I wonder now, is it because you're scared of Horus? Horus is a devil when he's roused, and if you'd bumped me off and he'd got to know about it, there'd been hell to pay. Possibly you're wise. Possibly," snarled Bloom, as though he did not believe it, and the saint nodded. "There is always the chance that I might go and talk to the police, isn't there?" Bittle was lighting a cigar, and he looked up with a twisted mouth. "You are not a man who loses his nerve and goes yelping to Scotland Yard, Mr. Templar," he answered. "Also, there is quite a big prize at stake. I think we can rely on you." The saint stared back with a kind of reluctant admiration. "Almost I see in you the makings of sportsmen," he said. "I can only hope," returned Bittle impassively, "that you will find the sport to your liking." Simon shook his head. "You won't disappoint me, beautiful one," he murmured. "I feel it in my bones. And so to bed. Give the tiger my love, and tell him I'm sorry I wasn't able to meet him." And the saint paused, struck by a sudden thought. "By the way, about Fernando. You know somebody's going to swing for him, don't you? I mean, if things start to go badly, make sure the tiger gets all the blame to himself, or else you might swing with him." "We shall be careful," Bittle assured him. "Splendid," said the saint. "Well, cheerio, souls. Sleep tight and pleasant dreams." He sauntered to the French windows and opened them. "If you don't mind. I have a rooted dislike for dark corridors. One never knows, does one?" "Mr. Templar," the millionaire stopped him. "Before you go." The saint turned on the terrace and looked back into the room. He was still debonair and smiling, and although the shrubbery had given the coup de grace to his ancient and disreputably comfortable clothes, he contrived by some subtle gift of personality to look immaculate enough to wander into Claridge's without the commissionaire spotting him and shooing him round to the tradesman's entrance. Only the saint knew what an effort that air of careless ease cost him. The atmosphere was positively dripping with the smell of rats, but Simon Templar never twitched a nostril. "Comrade? It might save you spending a sleepless night and catching your death of cold," observed Bittle, "if I told you that the tiger has already left. So you needn't bother to hang about outside." "Thanks," said the saint. "I won't. and it might save you a longish walk and a lot of trouble if I told you that Oris and I sleep in watches, turn and turn about, so that any of your pals who call round in the hope of being able to catch us napping will have to be very fly. Slong! He vanished into the darkness like a wraith, almost before the men in the library could have realized that he was gone. He went scraping through the shrubbery again to the wall, got his coat over the top as before, and was over like a cat. He dropped lightly to the ground, pulled on the tattered coat, and struck off away from the wall, after no more than a couple of seconds' pause to listen and scan the blackness in every direction. Guided by an innate bump of locality, he established his bearings at once and set off on a wide detour that would bring him eventually into the grounds at the back of the manor. He advanced in short rushes, stopping and crouching in cover every 20 yards or so, straining eyes and ears for sign of stalkers behind or an ambush before. Nothing happened. The night was quiet and peaceful. He saw a light go on in an upper window of Bittle's house, and the distant hiss of the surf mingled with the rustle of grasses brushed by the breeze, but there was neither sight nor sound of any human being. "Damned odd," said Templar to himself, scratching his head, as he lay under a hedge, watching and listening like a frontiersman, after at least a dozen of these rushes. Flaming odd, or did I slip them by going over the wall? He had fully expected to find some spicy parting gift waiting for him as soon as he had got far enough away from Bittle's vicinity, when they would be hoping to take him off his guard, but nothing had interfered with his departure, and there had been no trace of even the feeblest attempt to create trouble for him when he arrived in the narrow lane that ran between the manor and Khan's house. "Hell!" said the saint almost indignantly. "Now, why in blazes did they want to let me go?" He had seen no lights in any of the manor windows, and with a sudden apprehension he looked at the luminous dial of his watch. He was already a couple of minutes overdue. He swung round and sprinted up the path to Khan's cottage. The saint literally fell on the bell,